They always said the biggest danger to her story wouldn't come from the palace, the press, or even the critics who never stopped digging. They said the real threat would be the man who knew her before the fairy tale, before the titles, before the cameras, before the world was watching. And today, that man's silence finally broke, because this morning didn't bring another harmless rumor or recycled headline. This morning brought a digital explosion, the kind that doesn't fade, doesn't apologize, and doesn't disappear. Screenshots, metadata, a dead URL resurrected from the internet's graveyard, and a past that refuses to stay buried. For years, Trevor Inglesen was treated like a ghost, the forgotten husband, the polite ex, the man who moved on. 7 years of marriage, a quiet divorce, an ironclad ender, no interviews, no leaks, no revenge. Until now, because something cracked. And once it cracked, everything spilled out. What surfaced wasn't gossip passed around at dinner parties. It wasn't a blurry photo or anonymous DM. It was forensic, archived, time-stamped, a website long dead, now violently alive again. At first glance, it looked harmless. Generic name, clean layout, nothing loud, nothing obvious. But this wasn't an acting portfolio. This wasn't charity work. This wasn't a lifestyle blog. This was a booking site. And at the bottom of the page, not an agent, not a manager, but a shell company. A company forensic sleuths traced back to one name, Trevor. And that's when panic reportedly exploded inside Montecito, because this wasn't something you could spin. You can't PR metadata. You can't sue screenshots. You can't your truth your way out of a digital receipt. This leak didn't come from a studio interview. It didn't come from a disgruntled insider. It came from the internet itself, cached pages, archived snapshots, and digital footprints that never forget. And the timing? That's what made it lethal. Why now, after a decade of silence? After the fairy tale, the wedding, the global spotlight, whispers say a line was crossed, a reference, a rewrite of history, a narrative that painted the ex as something he wasn't, or maybe something even simpler. Maybe the ender expired. Whatever the trigger was, the gun went off, and the bullet is now tearing through the carefully built Duchess narrative. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to the gray years, 2011 to 2013. The public version says this was the Suits era. Toronto, auditions, a struggling actress grinding her way up. But even back then, something didn't add up. The travel didn't match the paychecks. The lifestyle didn't match the role. The movement was erratic. LA, Europe, yachts, private events. And this leak fills in the gaps the official story never explained. The screenshots allegedly show a profile on a now defunct talent aggregator. But the categories tell the real story. Not acting, not hosting, event appearances, private companionship, elite travel availability. This wasn't backstage hustle. This was the gray market. And suddenly the relationship dynamic looks different. Not husband and wife, manager and asset. Did he build the site? Did he manage the bookings? Or was he simply the safe harbor, the man she returned to once the bookings were complete? That's why the palace was never afraid of tabloid gossip. They were afraid of Trevor because he doesn't just know what she's like in private, he allegedly holds the receipts for what she did in public when no one was watching. Let's talk specifics. One archived capture dated August 2011, just weeks before the Jamaica wedding. The image, professional, sultry, nothing like the girl next door brand that came later. The bio didn't list degrees. It didn't list internships. It listed discretion. And that word appears again and again. Discretion isn't for casting calls, it's for men with security details. And the contact email? Not an agent, not a studio, a shell company, registered in 2010, under Trevor's name. That's the moment everything changes, because it reframes the marriage itself. Not a romantic collapse, but a business dissolution. When the ring was mailed back, it wasn't just a breakup. It was a firing, a management change. And that's when the story shifts from Trevor to something bigger. Something more polished, more powerful, more protected, because as one operation ended, another began. And somewhere inside a quiet mansion in Montecito, a screen lit up with a font she hadn't seen in years, a photo she thought was erased, a past she believed was destroyed, and standing in the doorway, confused and silent, was Prince Harry. What is this? And for the first time, the spin didn't come fast enough, because dates don't lie, emails don't forget, and the seed of doubt planted long ago finally started to grow. And this was only the landing page. Because what happens when you click enter? That's where the real story begins. The landing page was never the business, it was the bait. Because in the digital underground, the real money never sits in the storefront. It hides behind passwords, invitations, and coded language meant for people who already know what they're buying. And when this leak spread beyond screenshots into back-end data, the panic shifted from damage control to full containment. According to the material circulating online, this site wasn't searchable. It wasn't public-facing. It was an invite-only portal, a closed ecosystem designed for a very specific tier of client. And what detonated the situation wasn't just the URL resurfacing. It was the alleged admin access. Once inside, the illusion collapses. No acting credits, no humanitarian work, no inspirational branding, a menu. And this is where embarrassment allegedly turns into exposure, because the language isn't crude. It's corporate, sanitized, polished, the kind of wording that allows people to pretend they don't know exactly what they're buying while knowing precisely what they're buying. That's the danger. That's why it doesn't look illegal, it looks professional. Packages are listed, services framed as experiences, availability calendars structured like executive schedules. One option allegedly reads like a red carpet companion service, full evening attendance at galas, premieres, corporate events, media ready, camera safe, discreet. Translation, not a date, a brand accessory. Another tier references international travel, 48 hours to 7 days, passport ready, fluent conversation, elite discretion. This is the kind of offering that explains sudden overseas trips that never lined up with filming schedules. This is how unexplained luxury becomes work. And then there's the language that doesn't need translating. Holistic relaxation, private wellness, stress relief after high-level meetings. Nobody writes that for yoga classes. What turns this from speculation into something darker, at least according to online sleuths, is the pricing allegedly embedded in the back end. Numbers that don't resemble acting fees, retainers that don't align with cable television salaries at the time, premium rates that suggest clientele with more money than curiosity. That's when whispers turns to alarms. Because attached to this data wasn't just pricing, it was feedback, testimonials, and while public-facing versions keep clients anonymous, metadata allegedly does not. IP fragments, initials, locations, dates, just enough to start cross-referencing flight logs, public appearances, archived social posts. One entry dated September 2012. Location, Istanbul. Reviewer initials, Mr. R. The comment, according to screenshots being circulated, praises intelligence, discretion, and understanding the assignment. Mentions privacy. Mentions future bookings. And that's when timelines began lining up too cleanly to ignore. Public photos place her in Istanbul that same month. At the time, the explanation was inspiration, travel, culture, personal growth. But now the question hangs in the air like smoke. Was it personal or contractual? And here's the part that reportedly sent shockwaves through elite circles. Rumors that additional data dumps include deeper client logs. Not names, but enough breadcrumbs to terrify institutions that rely on silence. Because if even one of those initials resolves into someone untouchable, the fallout doesn't stay personal. It becomes geopolitical, reputational, systemic. Inside Montecito, the story goes quiet, not because things are calm, but because everyone knows silence means lawyers are working overtime. DMCA takedowns fly, threats are issued, but mirrors multiply faster than they can be scrubbed. And that's when the spotlight reportedly shifts from the website to the pipeline. Because the leak doesn't just show what was offered, it allegedly shows where the traffic went next. Buried in old code redirects, email forwards, routing instructions that suggest a handoff, not a shutdown, an upgrade, a move from small-scale management to global facilitation, from local contacts to international brokers. And that's where the name people whisper doesn't belong to Hollywood at all. It belongs to London, to private clubs, to elite access disguised as social networking. Suddenly, the narrative of accidental friendship starts to look like onboarding. Wine nights look like vetting. Introductions look like transactions. And the chance meeting mythology begins to unravel under the weight of digital evidence. If this handoff happened and that's still an allegation, then the breakup wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. One manager replaced by another with better reach, better protection, and better clients, which reframes everything that came after. Because if the model was already in place, then proximity to power wasn't luck. It was targeted. And that's the part that reportedly unsettled the palace more than any tabloid headline ever could. Not scandal. Strategy, because strategy implies intent, and intent raises questions no institution once asked. Was access cultivated? Were relationships trial runs? Was proximity to royalty accidental or inevitable? Back inside the house, the image is no longer shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. It's colder than that. Devices checked in private, screens scrolled alone, a realization creeping in that the past wasn't messy, it was organized. And once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. The marriage begins to look less like destiny and more like a closed deal that went long. A subscription no one realized had auto-renewed. A contract where only one party knew the exit terms. Online, the reaction fractures into camps. Some call it misogyny, others call it a hit job. But the reason this won't die is simple. Receipts don't care about feelings. Archive data doesn't respond to PR statements. And Trevor, the silent ex, suddenly isn't silent anymore, even if he hasn't said a word. Because in the digital age, saying nothing while the evidence speaks is louder than any interview. If this leak is authentic and that's still being debated, it doesn't just challenge a reputation. It rewrites an origin story. It reframes victimhood. It turns empowerment branding into performance art with a price list. And now the question isn't, is this true? The question is, what happens next? Because once a narrative cracks, everyone who benefited from it starts backing away. Brands hesitate. Agencies distance. Invitations disappear. Silence spreads. And the internet keeps digging. This wasn't just a leak. It was a key. And once the lock is opened, the past doesn't stay polite. By the time the dust settles, this stops being about a website. It becomes about realization. Because once the archive surfaced, once the timelines aligned, once the language, routing, and structure were exposed, the illusion didn't just crack, it collapsed. What looked like chaos suddenly looked organized. What looked like luck started looking engineered. Inside the house, silence replaces arguments. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because everything has already been answered. When patterns repeat, coincidence dies. And when metadata speaks, denials sound hollow. This isn't the fall of a fairy tale, it's the exposure of a system. A system built on reinvention, curated narratives, selective memory, and the belief that the past could be overwritten if the present was loud enough. But the internet doesn't forget. It archives, it mirrors, it waits. And now every speech, every rebrand, every plea for sympathy runs into the same wall: receipts. What happens next isn't dramatic, it's quiet. Brands hesitate, allies distance. Invitations stop. Silence becomes contagious. Not outrage, not cancellation, just absence. And that's the real ending. Not scandal, but erasure. Because when a story is exposed as manufactured, the audience doesn't argue. They leave. And once they leave, the performance is over.